She graduated with a bachelor's and master's degree in landscape architecture from the University of California at Berkeley. And that was in 2018. So she started her first experience with Lloyd, which is a known landscape architecture throughout the country. She was in California for 3 years. And then she recently started a new job at MIG, and she's been there for about 3 years now. So she received a fellowship for her project research, and it was titled Deafscape. She had a project at an Architectural Digest magazine, and it's our pleasure to have her start our presentation today. So please welcome Alexa. Hello, everybody. So my name is Alexa. I'm a landscape designer and specialist. I specialize in access. I do work for MIG office. That's more, I miss that. And my work is about Deafscape. So it's really applying landscape architecture to spaces that the deaf inhabit. So my family is all hearing. I started learning sign language recently, about 4 years back, and I started to identify as a deaf person. So I'm more comfortable using my voice for presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and change and use my voice.
As I mentioned, I started identifying as deaf about 3 to 4 years ago during my time at UC Berkeley, when I started learning ASL. And as both a deaf person and a landscape designer, I realized that there is a big gap in representation in the ADA standards for accessible design, which do not include much of anything for the deaf and hard of hearing community as far as design of public spaces is concerned. So the only standards provided for us are visual fire alarms inside of buildings and the provision of captioning at large stadiums. They also mention TTY phones, but these are actually not as well used anymore, as we know. Not as many people are really using them. Next slide. So in my last year of undergrad, I discovered DeafSpace, and this is my deaf friend I made as a result, Derek Femdrosa, who is here today. And I connected with him online shortly after watching this video, and he was my first deaf friend. As most of us know, DeafSpace was created by Gallaudet's deaf community under the guidance of architect Ansel Baumann in 2010. It includes many principles to design spaces where deaf and hard of hearing people can not only access, but also flourish in space. And so this is a great video to watch by Vox if you haven't seen it already. It really opened my eyes to what I could do as a landscape designer to bring my identity into my work. Next slide. So the DeafSpace design guidelines are predominantly focused on building interiors. Similarly to the ADA standards, the guidelines have 5 main sections, which highlight the importance of providing deaf and hard of hearing people 360-degree sensory reach and having enough visibility and space to communicate. I decided to take the first 4 sections of the guidelines discover how we can apply them to landscape architecture and create a deafscape. And so these sections are space and proximity, sensory reach, mobility and proximity, and light and color. And the fifth, regarding electromagnetic interference and acoustics, is more relevant to building interiors, but we should probably study it more too for outdoor spaces. Next slide. The article and graphic I created focuses on 8 depth space principles taken from those 4 sections of the depth space design guidelines, and I applied them to a figurative urban streetscape. So these are meant to go beyond the ADA requirements and to create even more space for the deaf community to enjoy. And of course, other disabled groups and non-disabled groups of people serve to reap the benefits as well. They are generally good practices, that they're not often fully incorporated into public spaces though. So I'm going to provide an example of each principle in landscape architecture case studies. And these are designs unknowingly applying depth space principles, which is often the case. Usually designers don't know much about depth space, but these are examples of what it can look like in real life. Next slide. The first principle is textured transition, which provides tactile and often visual cues between the sidewalk, planting areas, and the street. These can be felt with the feet while walking and having a conversation, or with a tactile cane. So this makes it particularly useful for blind and deafblind folks. Next slide. An example is the material contrast along the edges of pathways at Smith Plaza at the University of New Mexico. And this was designed by Surface Design. In this instance, there is a gravel material change at the edges of a concrete pathway, which serve as a tactile cue to move along and stay centered on the path. However, this can take many forms. So on urban sidewalks where gravel might not be as convenient, we can use paver or brick, or a different type of textured concrete can be used to create contrast and safety at the edges of curbs. The second is the shoulder zone, where people can step off of the main path of circulation to communicate, check phones, or just slow down and rest. Next slide. A good example is at Dilworth Park in Philadelphia, designed by Olin, who I worked for 3 years. In this case, there is a textured and visual contrast, room to park bikes, throw away trash, and step off of the sidewalk. Everything is placed away from the main path and doesn't obstruct movement. Next slide. The third is the degree of enclosure. This is one of my personal favorite depthscape principles because it helps me feel safe from the back. We deaf folks are very reliant on sight and 360-degree sensory reach to understand what's going on. If someone comes up from the back out of our sight lines, it startles us if we don't see them. Next slide. An example is the high-backed wooden benches at Chicago Riverwalk, designed by Sasaki. These allow people to sit and view the river and passersby, but provide the desired security at the back. Next slide. The fourth is night lighting, which is common sense, but so necessary for safety and visibility, again, due to reliance on sight for communication between deaf and hard of hearing people. If we can't see clearly, we are very unlikely to use this space at night. I know I'm not the only one that's had to leave an event early because we just weren't comfortable and couldn't see. So it's also important though not to have too much glare, which can cause discomfort and eye strain, which we all know too well. Next slide. An example is the pavilions at Railroad Park in Birmingham, Alabama, designed by Tom Leader's studio. And these provide a good amount of light, which provides vision at night, but is also soft and warm enough to prevent bad glare, creating spaces for people to safely and comfortably congregate in the evening. So this is good also for women and children to feel safer at night. Next slide. The next is flexible seating, which helps accommodate conversations more easily. to keep the line of sight that we really need to communicate. There's room to move around and to adjust the seating. Furnishing should be durable and made with good materials so that they last. And of course, we usually have that preference for round or U-shaped tables so that we can really keep that line of sight. Next slide. These are loose tables and chairs at Bryant Park in New York, designed by Olin. I use these as an example because they have really lasted the test of time and are very well used. They can be moved around to accommodate different groups of people. For example, a deaf person could adjust lines of sight, a blind person could make room for their guide dog, and a wheelchair user could roll up to the table. Next slide. The sixth is a wider pathway, which comes up often in my conversations with other disabled folks, not just the deaf community. I recommend a bare minimum of 10 feet on busy public sidewalks. 6 to 8 feet can often work on less trafficked areas, but providing space to move is really important for deaf folks to communicate while walking through space and for general comfort, especially since there are so many delivery people, cyclists, and scooters these days. Next slide. An example of a really wide pathway here is at Thornton Creek Water Quality Channel in Seattle, designed by my new office, MIG and SBR. This is a public plaza in a mixed-use development in a busy area and provides a lot of space for multiple people to move at the same time. It's a really lovely meandering sidewalk connected to the public streetscape. Next slide. The next is rhythm, which creates visual patterns along sidewalk edges, and this helps us to move along and serves as a type of wayfinding, particularly in our peripheral vision when we're walking down a path. Next slide. An example of colorful eclectic rhythm is at Wilmington Waterfront Park in Los Angeles, designed by Sasaki. These are red sculptural light posts, which provide stimulating movement through the site and can ease navigation. Lines of trees also work really well, and this park has some lines of trees too, in addition to the light posts. Next slide. The final is a visual cue, which I touched on briefly and can take many forms. The most important places to have visual cues are at pedestrian crossings. This includes flashing light fixtures, painted street lines, and contrasting sidewalks, as well as bump outs at curbs, which help increase pedestrian visibility and safety. Next slide. An example of a good visual cue is at the West Capitol Avenue streetscape, also designed by my new office, MIG, and this is in West Sacramento. There is a very clear area created for the crosswalk with color contrast, extending striping, and clear sightlines, which claims pedestrian space and moves folks along with the design of the crosswalk itself. Next slide. Another question I often receive is what just doesn't work well for the deaf community. Next slide. The biggest again is narrow sidewalks. So there's barely any room to move here. As you can see, the sidewalk would likely only accommodate one person at a time, single file. We would not be able to communicate well or easily on the sidewalk. The poles could be hazards to wheelchairs and other assistive devices and guide dogs as well. Next slide. The next, any obstruction randomly placed, sometimes not as obvious as this bollard, can cause hazards for deaf folks signing, blind folks using canes or guide dogs, and even cyclists whipping around a corner. So obstructions can also include benches sited too far into a sidewalk or other site furnishings like chairs and waste bins. So it's really important to set them off of the sidewalk, like in shoulder zones, for example. Next slide. Another obvious one is poor street tree selection. We've become more aware of this over time, as sidewalks have been very badly busted, rendering them completely inaccessible to wheelchair users and other mobility disabled folks. And it can make us trip when we are signing or talking with others while walking. By implementing silva cells and other new tree growth technology, we've begun to ameliorate this issue. But maintenance plans for the trees is also just as important, because they can become very obstructive and whack people in the face. For deaf folks signing while moving, and for blind folks who can't see branches, this is a big deal and can cause great discomfort and sometimes injury while moving through space. Next slide. Recently, I had the opportunity to work on a small real-life deafscape project for Gallaudet on Hanson Plaza. I'm only going to touch on this briefly because I was working on this with my prior office, Olin, and this is not the completely final design. But we took a look at the existing plaza, which is an upper and lower level over a parking structure, and has existing planting beds and vacant fountain spaces, as well as a community garden and small outdoor amphitheater. Next slide. I just wanted to take a moment to highlight one of the diagrams that I worked on, because I spent a lot of time on this project thinking about how we could create new deaf spaces or deafscapes for students at the plaza. So we had a lighting consultant focusing on lighting, and most of the paths were already over 10 feet wide, which was great. So I focused particularly on adding in or emphasizing degrees of enclosure for students to have comfortable rest spaces, and also on shoulder zones for students to comfortably step off of the main path. I also took a close look at flexible furnishings such as loose round tables, chairs, and umbrellas, and also at fixed benches shaped in circular and U shapes. And we also took a look at shade structures and other mechanisms to create more comfort on the plaza. There's also potential to use tactile cues for warnings around design elements that jut out or around stairs and ramps. So I really look forward to seeing how this project comes to life. It was really a pleasure to work with Christopher Hoffman to get their vision on paper for this plaza. Next slide. Thanks again so much for having me today. Thank you. I'm really looking forward to discussion.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Alexa, for such an interesting presentation about deafscapes on the trees and in the cities. We wanted to save some of the questions for you until the end of the session. We have our next presenter. Derek Bem, Steph, and he went to Gallaudet University. And he undergrad, he had his undergrad major in English, and then he went to grad school to get his master's degree in urban and regional planning. And he graduated in 2019. He's currently working, establishing his own business, Cooper and Water as a Consultant is the name of his company, and he's working for Gallaudet as a development specialist, and he's been here since last year. So we are pleased to have Derek present with us today. Welcome. Thank you. All right, hello everyone. I know I'm looking at myself right now, but I'm looking forward to seeing all your faces at the very end of the presentation. For today's presentation, I was thinking about what I was going to discuss, and I thought I would discuss my capstone thesis that I worked on. In grad school, like Robert mentioned, I focused on urban and regional planning, and I was thinking about the links with the deaf community, and with my degrees. So I started to do some research, and interestingly enough, I found some good information I thought I'd share with you. So architects and urban planners are different professions, but we certainly work closely together. And I find myself always working close with architects who are motivated about working with deaf space. My capstone was titled Deaf Space. And as we know, design principles, architecture, we were thinking about how that was going to apply to urban planning. And if that helps elevate equity in DC. I focused on DC because it was a huge deaf community, and Gallaudet University is in DC as well. So we analyzed two of the major planning documents. The comprehensive plan was developed in 2006, and DC Cultural Plan was put out in 2019. So from those two planning documents, what I did was I took a look at culture, equity, deaf people, and we decided to identify some of the things that we wanted to look at it. The comprehensive plan in 2006 was a broad plan, intentionally thinking about how we could predict the city growth in the next 10 years. Actually, 20 years. My apologies. And every 4 years, that document would be amended with updates and perhaps some changes as the city grows rapidly. And so they had to look at the comprehensive plan and update what they had. What I thought was interesting is they would identify different elements and they would break them down. So there was 13 elements and 36 guiding principles. You may be wondering what those are. The elements that were included were things like environment, urban growth, and framework, just as a broad scope of one of them. And then we looked at cultural arts and culture. And so what I did was I selected framework and arts culture, and I wanted to take a deeper dive into that. Principle 36 is all about how planners incorporate design when they're thinking about planning a city. And there's 36 different pieces, but I picked two of them that I felt were relevant to culture. The first one was successful neighborhoods, that focuses on the relationship, one neighbor connecting to another neighbor, and also how people can connect on an individual level, influenced by the design of the city. And it's important to recognize back in 2006, the city in DC was expanding. There was parts of DC that hadn't really grown or developed. There was a lot of struggles with economic development throughout DC, as well as providing enough resources for the city. And so they would view, and we would view culture as an amenity at the time to help revitalize the whole city of DC. There were some things that were phrased in this as things like cultural arts as an amenity can help stimulate the economic growth. There are other things in the guiding principles that recognizing that they wanted to connect to people. And in order to do that, we'd have to provide access. Access would mean access to non-English speaking people. And what that really meant was that arts and culture was, we would perceive that as who was generating arts and culture. And that's people who spoke English, meaning deaf people, were deaf people even involved in that discussion. So there was a lot of interesting framing there that centered around the idea of abled bodies dominating certain themes. So in 2018 in DC, the plan, they changed their model from a revitalization process to an equity-based process. And what that looked like was really at first, what they gave all the information out to everybody that DC, they have their cultural economic revenue, and it's over $100 billion in DC alone. DC profits $1.1 billion from tax revenue from the cultural related events. That's a lot. It's a huge economic impact. And it certainly can impact how the city is designed and built for future growth. especially thinking about what would happen. So in 2019, DC started expanding, and we noticed that the new developments sometimes would push out other cultures. We saw a lot of gentrification happening throughout DC. So we started taking a look at that and try to think what we were going to do. Next slide. So the difference between both of those plans is that in 2006, they focused on the cultural as an amenity to become an asset. But in 2019, the focus was on culture as a resource. A resource meaning people who had cultural resources could become leaders in a developing city. And so those models were a little bit different. And in DC cultural planning, they recognize that public places, just like Alexa just mentioned, public parks, spaces where people congregate, must be accessible. Those places are also critical for cultural creation, for people to express their culture and for people to receive different people's culture and appreciate it. Next slide. One fascinating thing about DC cultural planning is they had mentioned the deaf community and deaf culture. And this was the first time in a planning document ever to acknowledge deaf culture. I call that a birth of deaf culture in a systematic planning document. We have it. We have it in Washington, D.C. And I think that was huge. But of course, it's only one page. And really that one page recognized that deaf culture was there. It was there in Washington, D.C. It was valuable. It was a valuable asset and something that people needed to look at. And of course, Gallaudet played a big role in that. And we had to find ways to connect. So that happened. And really, it was just recognizing the need and the potential, but there was nothing to do with planning. And so when we talked about community planning, there was the blueprint, but that wasn't always true. There isn't always the blueprint. With community planning, people pass it on as guidelines for people in future development to make decisions. And the application part of that is still left up to interpretations. So I'm gonna, give me a second, I'm gonna look at my notes. So one thing that I think is important to mention, oh, actually, can we move on to the next slide, please? So the cultural framework back during revitalization until now, how culture is going to lead community development and capacity building means that some cultures have limited resources within their own communities and culture. And thinking about how those communities are taking responsibility to lead city development and actually how can they benefit from those changes? That way, in a way that'll promote more equity and equitable responses. So that's really on the planners for them to look at the social infrastructures. And every city has a social infrastructure. So what the planners are responsible for is how to plan and grow the design, the building of the spaces in a way that they could support the social infrastructure. I thought that was really interesting. And so based on that, other organizations can get grant funding and they can also build out social infrastructures in a way that can support community development. How this translates to architectures, in architecture is you have to build the buildings over there. And of course, it's what happens before from the planning documents as a foundation that's going to impact how buildings are built. Social infrastructure, if it's weak, if it doesn't have enough resources dedicated to it, it can lead to common city problems that we see all over the place. So we can see crime, a lack of community collaboration, a lack of feeling of belonging. The city is not stable. Economic development is weak. So certainly we want to recognize that there is value there.
So now in terms of Gallaudet University, Gallaudet is the largest employer of deaf people who use American Sign Language. So I found this particular graphic when I was working at Gallaudet several years ago, and I was fascinated with this map. It has pins and the colors are different. I'm not sure what the blue, yellow, red means in particular, but really it just focuses on where Gallaudet employees live in Washington, DC. And if you look at this map, you'll see that 1/3 of Gallaudet employees live in Washington, DC. This particular map is from 2010 and it shows where folks live. And if you look, Gallaudet is actually very close to that cluster of blue pins. So a lot of people do live close to campus. And what that particular map shows me is that there is a signing and ASL vibrancy, and it is location specific in Washington, DC. It's apparent. So, you know, our only data representation of the deaf community is this map, and this was from 2010. So it is a little outdated right now. Next slide, please. So as many of you have heard, you know, Gallaudet is planning a 6th Street development, and it's property that Gallaudet does own. They're partnering with a developer called JBC Smith. They've developed 1,800, they're planning to develop 1,800 units, give or take, and 130,000 square feet of retail space and approximately 450,000 square feet of administrative office building and university use building. So it is a large development plan. Next slide. And in the development agreement with Gallaudet and the developer, it does require the use of deaf design principles. So this actually shows different design elements that we are going to be using and that should be taken into consideration when designing and building these particular developments on 6th Street. Next slide, please. And you can see here there's different design elements and principles, and these principles, you know, they're illustrated here, but now we have to figure out how to apply them, how to use these deaf space and design principles. You know, many architects know how design spaces, classrooms, private spaces, general rooms, you know, they're all designed differently. So these particular designs aren't just necessarily standard for everything. What you do is really need to look at the function of a space and then how a particular design would apply to that space. So the developer and Gallaudet have been deciding how to partner and use that space. We can go to the next slide. And we've identified different deaf space design, and we've done a deep dive in terms of how much deaf space should be in a particular building and space, and we've broken it down into 3 groups here: full scope, reduced scope, and minimum scope. Full scope means that everything from building height, whether it's blocking natural light and that type of those types of considerations. We want to make sure that hall traffic is suitable, that it's wide, because look, you know, for example, this is we know that deaf people will be using this space, and we need to understand that we need to have deaf space and design integrated into those spaces because of that. And hallways at Gallaudet University is one of those examples. So the design process and approval, we do want to make sure that deaf individuals are designed in each stage of the approval process. That is an important and minimum requirement. So this here is an aerial view of the development plan. We've identified areas that are near campus. You can see the bottom area that's dark pink. Those are full scope buildings, and those are required to have full use and utilization of deaf space in their design. And then we can see the area that's labeled C across from 6th Street. Some people have asked, why wouldn't we have all the buildings as full scope deaf space design? And really, it's a huge challenge in terms of analyzing the cost, in terms of utilizing this deaf space. In terms of square footage does have a value and a price tag associated with it. So in terms of building costs and revenue streams, there does need to be a balance and consideration of that. So the developer was willing to make that investment in identifying certain areas that could be full scope, but doing the entire development would require just a considerable amount of money. So we were fortunate to have this partnership with JBL Smith and their willingness to invest in terms of their deaf space principles into their design. So it's really been something that I've learned a lot in regards to. We can go to the next slide. And this really brings us to the reality of implementation. It's not always easy. So for example, I just mentioned, the square foot value compared to building. For example, if you're looking at an apartment building and you look at how many units a particular building could fit in a building, the developer would want to maximize the potential, the unit potential of a particular space to be able to maximize revenue and profit. Revenue benefits people who invest in particular developments. This particular developer is a publicly traded company, so they need to make sure that their investors are happy with their projects. So there is a balance between the risk, compared to losing several units to have more space in consideration of deaf space and wider hallways. There is a lot of negotiation in that process, and it is challenging because deaf space hasn't gotten to the point where we could say, okay, if you invest $5 more in every square foot for deaf space, this design principle, you would have a revenue, a guaranteed design or guaranteed return of investment of $10. So there's just not enough data or research to support that at this point. So now equity in building, often that is in conflict with capitalist values of building. So framing it as a resource in terms of long-term benefits, we have to really advocate that, and that requires a shift in how people think about investments and resources. Next, Gallaudet University has to have the burden of what Gallaudet is expected to do, in really meaning the expectations are very high, and the question is, well, if Gallaudet gets a significant amount of resources, they do need to. It is a big campus. They do need to make sure that it's equitable. So Gallaudet does have a burden in this project as well, in terms of implementing this project, making sure that it satisfies the needs of its deaf students and also satisfy the needs of a developer, and having this developer believe in Gallaudet is a big ask. So now the cultural framework that I just mentioned, the DC cultural plan, we need to look at how that is going to apply to the 6th Street development. The good thing is that the development is still in process, so we do have more opportunities going forward to look at that and apply those principles. Next slide. So my recommendations for an inclusive future, really it's a discussion about culture. Culture itself is an abstract concept. How can you define culture and put a value on culture? It's not like a standard like the environment or something where you can look at, look, this is solar. Solar power gives you this much power. The cost is this, and you can calculate the definition or meaning of it really easily. But culture as a driver of change is difficult. It's how do you put a price tag on that? So of course, the cultural plan does feel a little bit abstract in terms of the implementation, what the intention is. Should there be a cultural framework in the first place? That is a question. But then on the other side of the coin, yes, of course, there should be a cultural framework to promote people to start thinking about how to implement building community in terms of development. If it's lacking there, it means that we're not asking people to pay attention to these types of considerations. But if there are guidelines, if there are considerations and procedures spelled out, then it becomes prescriptive. If you want to address culture, you need to do X, Y, and Z. And culture itself is a dynamic thing. It's not static. So, in terms of the cultural plan, it's a good start. There's different perspectives on it. And right now, it doesn't have a lot of teeth in terms of enforcement, but it does provide a lot of thought, consideration on how architects, city planners should consider the design process. Next slide. So other challenges with this particular research, the story of the deaf community and how the city develops. There's not been much documentation of that. It's something that started in early 2000s. It's very young. It's a very new project. Overall, we need to look at how we need to look at the situations to figure out solutions. Like, do people want to live in cities and in building environments that are designed this way? So we just don't have a lot of data about that or documentation about that. We hope that that will identify systemic barriers that are there in the deaf community. And then at that point, we can provide resources and tools about how to dismantle them. Next slide. So there's lots of different recommendations in my capstone thesis. There's different metrics for how we can, include marginalized communities, the deaf community, for example. Secondly, we can do more research in terms of collecting data from the deaf ecosystem, from deaf individuals in terms of where they live, demographics, what their income and spending potential may be. Identifying those data points will help us figure out how to really look at the urban setting and how we can contribute. So, I do want to put some responsibility on DC's Office of Public Planning. They do have, Gallaudet's been here since 1864, and they're finally in 2019 identifying a need for adding the deaf to the urban planning environment. So really, we just need to demand more of our city. And there will be a post-academic study published that looks at, after 3 or 4 years, what people are saying about these buildings. It's important to collect that data after these projects are concluded and get feedback on that. Next slide. Well, actually, I think that may be it. Yes, that's correct. So, wow, that went by fast. So I do look forward to the question and answer at the end of our discussions. Thank you. Well, thank you, Derek, for your interesting project and research for improving DC. It will hold question and answer until after Todd's presentation. This next presentation is from Todd, Todd Ray Page. And I just want to give a little bit about his background. He got his bachelor's in architecture from the University of Virginia. He's worked for quite a while as a partner at his former firm, Studio 27 Architecture, where he worked at many different projects, from large buildings to small residential projects in the DC area. He's actually won many awards from different chapters of the AIA, and he's now working as the principal architect at a different firm called PAGE, and it's one of the nation's largest architecture firms based here in DC. He is the recipient of several awards, as I mentioned, for his work in the DC area. And one of his more recent awards was the John Benshaw Award for Architecture. Interpreter error on that award, but he won that award recently, and he got that award from the AIA. So today we have the pleasure of having my friend, actually, Todd, here today to make a presentation. So welcome. And I'll turn the floor over to you.
Getting ready here. Thanks everyone for the time today. And I have to say, I was getting ready for this. I was thinking about how long I've known Robbie. And we both have gray hair, Robbie, because I realized that we've known each other for 20 years now. The first day that I met you when you walked into our studio. And so it's wonderful because you inspired me a lot through these years. And so thank you again for letting us have this time together. So when Robbie first approached, it was a question of, can you show some of the work that we've been doing over the years? And so for the last, I think it's a little over 8 to 9 years, I've been supporting and working with Gallaudet University in one way or another, be it sort of smaller projects or sort of larger interventions. And so I find that it's a real privilege to work with the deaf community, and I'm humbled by it. And I would say that each day I learn from it. And so what I'm going to be doing today is presenting some of the work that we've done here. It's only a few samplings. We've completed a little over 13 projects on campus. And that whole time sort of working and exploring through the deaf space design guidelines. And then so the quick overview is going to be 3 types of project classifications, but we'll get there in a moment. So what we have here on the screen is to locate Gallaudet within the District of Columbia, which I'm not sure if everybody has been on campus, but I assume a lot of you know. And then on the right-hand side of the slide in blue is the Gallaudet campus and how it sits within the city as a whole. About 1.5 miles from the nation's capital, very close to an arts and entertainment district, close to a new metro station of several years ago, and just a vibrant developing community. Next slide. Just to give you a sense really quickly of the quality of the campus is that it feels as though it's a bucolic campus. Really beautiful buildings. It obviously has its 1970s buildings that I don't show here, but are not the wonderful buildings on campus like Chapel Hall here. But then around the edge, we have this industrial area, and that's the area that Derek was actually just speaking about with 6th Street development. And so the meatpacking district, as it previously was, is now being completely reimagined. And that's another lecture another time, and Derek touched on it well. Next slide. And as I mentioned, this document was developed, this particular copyright is from 2010, and developed with Gallaudet University with the Deaf Space Project. But these are the guidelines and sort of the outline of the guidelines, and a lot of people speak to them. They're very hard to get their hands on them, but an amazingly good document that's well read and well researched, and has a lot to do with the implementation of space, particularly as we do it at Gallaudet. Next slide. So big overview is that this was done through research projects from a group of individuals and then also a group of students through the Deaf Space Project at Gallaudet University. A lot of time spent in observation, contemplation, evaluation, but really coming down to these 3 components, which I think are important and I've learned to begin to work within, and that's visual language, the notion of visually communicating. And I think one of the most rich and tangible aspects, particularly of architecture, is how we begin to extend the sensory perception and the senses that we do have, extend those into space, and then how space can then reinforce that experience. Next slide. So in some of our first exploration, what we wanted to do was understand it. Obviously, I'm not a deaf individual. And then so I don't experience space in the same way. And then so I've done a lot of drawing and thinking to try to learn and begin to understand how that happens. One of the first sketches I did that ultimately became this drawing was trying to contemplate what the space of signing is. And then that becomes the space of language. And then how does that actually change relative to scale of the human body, accessibility and mobility? And then also the scale of space and its relationship to one place or another. And so I engaged Le Corbusier's modular and developed what we call the depth space modular. And so that began to give us really a sense of scale and an understanding of how that scale worked with the human dimension. Next slide. Then it became sort of a charge. How do we as architects begin to understand, engage, and communicate effectively with a community that we're learning from? And I would say that through the years, Gallaudet has been very generous in helping us learn and to work in communicating together. So these images begin to show a few things that we've learned through time. One is in our first design charrettes, which honestly, Derek was president of the student body then. and so we've known each other for a little while as well. But we did some 3D models that actually had Braille on them as well, because we had deaf-blind individuals who were part of the student body helping in our design efforts. Another thing we learned is to try to draw renderings of the spaces that we were designing together. And they come in many different stages, but ultimately get to a rendering that is as close as to what the reality is going to be. So the top rendering is a drawing that we did and developed probably 10 different options. And then the lower image is the photograph of what the space actually became. To say that we try to make those as close as we can possibly get them. And then another element, the top left image, is a full-scale mock-up of a desk that we were going to make. And then so that was a way that we could engage the human body at a real scale and then get direct feedback to understand how modifications should occur. And so these became 3 primary modes of communication for our understanding as we navigate the space forward. Next slide. There. And then so what we did for one of our later projects was we actually developed full classroom environments. And in those, we had developed renderings together, the top left image. From those renderings, we changed and tweaked space. Then we built full-scale educational environments. And Robert held and then used a GoPro camera to film what it meant to teach in that space and learn in that space. And then we looked at those movements in the space and how people navigated those spaces to then even modify one more time before we actually built the space. And it had to do with the relationship of sitting so that you could sign. It had to do with where the interpreter was. And then also primary education screens. and then the elevations of accessibility and visual access. Next slide. And then so really quickly, we're moving into 3 now, which was basically the implementation of a lot of the elements that were in the master plan. So next slide. So through time, basically the master plan was from 2012 to 2022, which obviously we're coming up on very quickly now. We started working with the university about 2013. Since that time, everything in light blue, we've basically touched. I think there are 2 projects that are shown on here that didn't get executed or are not part of our work. But these are the elements of the overall 12 to 22 master plan that have been implemented. And the beautiful thing about that implementation is that it has occurred through the guidance of the Deaf Space Guidelines. Next slide. So the first grouping of projects we did was a series of dormitory renovations. And so these residence halls, we were changing the common areas to make them more deaf friendly and to create student social spaces. Next slide. And then to quickly orient you to these slides, just to get a sense of there's a lot of visual information. And as we navigate the slide itself, the bottom right-hand side is a black and white image of the before. And then the color images are the after. You can ignore all of the text. That's just for me. Thank you. And then so what you can see here is that the dormitory originally had these closed-in walls and very small windows. And this was the primary public space. And then so what we did was we carved away all of those walls, created larger windows, and then made connective spaces for visual communication. And then one of the keys here was the ability to actually have visual communication from interior to exterior, from the front door through to the elevator lobby, and from this sitting area out to the primary commons and entrance of the building. Next slide. And so here you can see, this is the before, where it had no sense of entry. And then we created a new sense of entry, you can see at the top, with illumination, a canopy, and a striated ceiling element. And then on the left-hand side, you can see the interior, which has a wood floor, which allows for some vibration communication for walking up and connecting to individuals without sneaking up on them. But also this public space that as an interior element connects to those who move by in this primary campus circulation. Next slide. This one was a charge to create a study space on the second level. This is Benson. And the lower slide, you can see there's a large masonry wall. The focus is actually on television. And then there's a door in the hallway to the back. The upper image, you can see we've removed all of those walls. What remained were basically columns. Created a study area, and then a warm wood backdrop. And I can say that this wood backdrop was an element of a lot of study because we wanted to create visual density, but not interruption. And so the fold that happens in the upper portion of the wall is actually above the signing zone. And then the wood floors obviously attenuate vibration to prevent sneaking up on individuals. And then I'm not quite sure if you can see it, but in the upper right-hand image, we also have visual clues in the floor for primary navigation for different levels of visual acuity. Next slide. And then here we can see the image on the lower left is the primary lobby areas. And then also the upper portion is how we begin to open up the wall and connect to the deck and terrace. Next slide. The next one is the learning spaces. We did a renovation to a STEM lab, 3rd and 4th floor, and then connected them. Forward. Next slide. And then so the lower level illustrating the corridor, and then right above it is the same vantage point where we opened it up, created new daylighting, and then various materials based upon the kind of navigation that we spoke about earlier. Next slide. And then carved a community space out of, you can see in the lower image, what was previously a dark classroom area that was a single floor. And then we created a circulation stair. Next slide. And then the laboratory spaces that we upgraded. And again, creating visual clues in the floor and in the walkways. Next slide. This is the common area. Next slide. 2 more quick images or projects. One, both of these are sculptural, and they're about engaging with deaf cultural space. This one was about visual connection, and it was just basically creating a visual screen between 2 floors, became a sculptural light element to prevent visual connection between a boys' dorm and a girls' dorm on different floors. Next slide. And that was done through a series of floating boxes where we were trying to illuminate the space by double. And then, as the previous slide had on it, this idea is based on a cumulus cloud formation. Next slide. This is a sculptural element that was really based on cultural and symbolism. And this was embedded in the STEM project that we spoke about a moment ago. The whole study was based upon 2, one deaf and one hard of hearing women who were what was called the women computers at Harvard University. But these 2 women created the scientific ways of measuring distance between stars that ultimately led to the scientific discoveries of measuring space between stars through solar spectrums. So understanding these as waves, we embedded these ideas and discoveries of Annie and Harriet into a sculpture. The next slide. that sculpture became embodied in the STEM building, in this woven tapestry of wood that also becomes a seating element to overlook this area that the sun just sort of pours into the core of the STEM lab. These waves were all generated from the solar spectrum waves that Harriet and Annie discovered and defined. But I don't know that anyone knows that but us now. But what I would say is that, next slide. This has now become the backdrop for Deaf U. And if all of us start spreading the rumors, maybe it will get out into the collective culture even more. But the excitement here is that the architecture that now has been informed over a 10-year aspiration of a master plan has embedded the concepts and discoveries of deaf space, is now being integrated into the culture at large through Deaf U with Netflix. But what's beautiful is how the culture is being disseminated through the architecture that we're making together.
Todd, I apologize. I'm going to have to interrupt you because of time.
That's the last slide. So thank you very much.
Okay, I appreciate that. I appreciate that, and thank you, Todd. So now it's time to move on to the Q&A. We've received about 6 questions. Please, let's have the presenters both come up on the screen. All of the presenters up on the screen. Thank you all for your wonderful presentations. You painted an interesting picture, much different than what we expected. So we have a list of questions, and this is for you all. The first question that we received is about deaf space. This question is, deaf space design also benefits everyone in different ways. JGB can consider benefits as well, especially related to universal design.
I can go ahead and answer that. I think it's a great question. Often people ask in terms of deaf space, what is that? Is that good design? Why not use universal design? Why not use human-centered design? Or any of these other design elements? It feels like yes. Why not use all of them? But what makes deaf space different is that deaf space is centered around the deaf experience and the perspectives of deaf individuals. So if we have a large amount of deaf users who are using these buildings, why not have deaf people in the center and look at what their experience is and how it could help the world. So really, we're in a place where that should be it should be consideration given. There's many hearing architects who have been involved in this process, have seen the value of the process, have seen that it's a different process, and has seen that it's a community-centered process and it's a cultural process that doesn't really come up in a universal design approach, but it does come up in deaf space. So that has been a wealth of experience that I cherish. So I do think that that's valuable, and it's something that can be brought back to investors and said, well, here, look, this is how we're justifying these expenses. That is the challenging part, and that's still something that's still ongoing.
And I want to follow up on what Derek was saying. This is Alexa speaking. I recently worked on a project with a fellowship that sort of branched off more with universal design and with other disabled community members. And really in my findings, kind of like echoing, what Derek was saying about just the fact that deaf space and deafscape focus so specifically on our personal needs as deaf and hard of hearing folks. But I think that there are a lot of like overlaps that I've discovered that I brought up, like with, you know, wider pathways, kind of moving obstructions off of the main path, having good lighting, having good seating options, just flexibility, and like having choices. All sorts of different things will benefit different disabled and non-disabled groups of people. And I think when we think about universal design, it's just it's very ambiguous, it's broad, it's not as specific to certain groups of people. So I like to treat it as this sort of like adaptive creative tool that builds off of the bare minimum of the ADA, but you still have to bring in community input, like specifically from disabled and deaf community members in order to actually make it work. Because, you know, the problem with non-disabled designers designing is that we have a lot of assumptions that don't necessarily cover everybody's needs. For example, I don't know what someone in a wheelchair specific experience is like, but I'm willing to talk to them and figure it out and find out like how we can overlap our needs and figure out how to just answer, like come to all these solutions. Yeah, it really requires a bit of everything. It's not just a matter of applying principles, but testing them and making sure that they actually work for the people we're designing for. That's where community-based design comes in.
All right, thank you. So the next question is from somebody who says they wanted to know about design accommodations and architecture design. And that's from Ireland, that won a bid for Gallaudet University at 6th Street development. What is the latest status regarding the development project? And what's happening with Gallaudet putting it on hold related to research regarding the consultant in JGB?
Yeah, so I mean, in the planning world, I mean, there's, especially in DC, look, DC is growing fast. There's lots of different development, and with lots of new development comes lots of appeals. One organization in DC that has continued to sue developers in Washington, DC, it has included Gallaudet's 6th Street development project. So the project was put on hold for more than 2 years to resolve these particular lawsuits and appeals that were, lodged. So Gallaudet has moved forward. The person who sued did lose the case. So now the project's back on. But in 2 years, DC has also changed their affordable housing regulations. So we had to go through a negotiation process with the developer because the developer wanted to add more affordable housing units. The developer said, look, we already have this process approved from 3 years ago. We had to let them know things have changed. So that caused things to, go longer. This is a normal process in the development world. So, it's something that I think the community felt like they were kind of left in the dark about because they were, they had to kind of sit back and wait for these things to resolve themselves. But Gallaudet very soon will be starting to engage the community again, updating the community regarding what's going on. So yes.
I think also maybe the question is related to the competition by Hall McKnight and what the current status is of the Gateway project. Is that correct?
Oh, yes, Derek, that's correct. Yeah, a Hall McKnight. Yeah, they won that international design competition. Thank you for mentioning that. So it's a public space that's going to be on Gallaudet's campus, and then we're going to have JBG Smith build and develop that. So my whole presentation was focused on BG Smith, not Hall McKnight. But that is another project that's working in parallel and does, yeah. So now, in terms of landscape design, it seems that this is a perfect fit in terms of deaf space and deaf space principles. So I appreciate all of the beautiful statements. What are some other areas or other projects that you see that could promote the use and principles of design that might not be considered yet?
Yeah, so I guess I can answer that. There are a lot of different projects that will kind of just apply bits and pieces of deaf space. And I think this is true of both architecture and landscape architecture. So, there are a lot of projects out there where you can kind of just do what I did today, where it's just, you highlight one or more deaf space principles that happen to show up in the design, but they weren't necessarily considered. They kind of just happened somehow in the design process. They weren't specifically created for the deaf community. So I think it's really interesting in retrospect that this is happening. And I hope that, more designers will actually specifically apply deaf space principles. I think the problem is the fact that the deaf space design guidelines are not like open to the public. They've never been publicly published. And so I think that that's a problem. I think that they should be published so that more folks can actually use them. But as far as other examples, I don't have any right now at the top of my head, but I do have a website that I'm continuing to sort of just populate with different resources. And this is with my my new fellowship work that I recently compiled, which was called Design with Disabled People Now. And so I'm happy to drop that link into the chat box, and people can kind of just take a look at that. That will have some resources up for you to kind of take a look at. And hoping to continue to compile some case studies there as well, just because, I kind of randomly will find some ideas and options to show as case studies. There aren't a lot of projects that specifically focus on deaf space, devscape, or universal design in general. A lot of them are just piecemeal applications. So, yeah.
Thank you. So let's go to the next question, and that's it's a question for Todd. It's from the same student, and it says, since your firm worked a lot with Gallaudet, has your office hired any full-time consultants for deaf space to work with your team?
We have 2 deaf architects on staff that we rely on, especially when the projects are happening with Gallaudet, to try to work with the design elements. And then honestly, I've recently started working a bit more with Hansel Baumann in some of the studies there. And then so we're always looking to extend that ability. We're looking at some projects now that are actually extending into more challenging space for us with blind space, and trying to figure out how we handle fully inclusive environments, dimensionally as well as perceptual abilities. And those challenges I find inspiring. And then so that's what we're looking at now. And so we're working to team right now with a blind architect who has done an extensive amount of design, and then trying to bring all of these together in one kind of space.
Well, thank you. I think that we are getting close to our time to conclude. I just want to thank everybody just for their wonderful presentations. We very much appreciate you taking the time. We do have our next session on Saturday morning at 11, and that is Eastern Standard Time. And that particular session is the morning chit chat session. So I do think it'll be a good time for everybody to hang out and to chat, to everyone to introduce each other, and just really have a chance to network some more. Very much looking forward to seeing everybody on Saturday morning. And I just want to thank all of our participants today. for just the thoughtful discussion, and have a great day, have a great evening, and just yeah, have a fabulous day.